Welcome everyone to part 3 of Unit 9, which is social psychology. Today what we're going to be looking at is group behavior. So the first thing we have to do, obviously, before we can start talking about group behavior is to talk about what a group is. What does this actually mean as far as psychology goes? So the basic thing is that a group is a set of individuals who interact over time and have a shared fate, goals, or identity. So there's really kind of two components here, right? So obviously there needs to be more than one person. You have to have multiple people. You need to interact over time. So if you went and you were in a room with a bunch of people, for 5 seconds and then you walked out, you probably wouldn't consider that a group, right? We're looking for interaction over a set period of time. Now that time can be relatively short, right? Like an hour or something like that. It can also be very long, right? Obviously, there's groups that you're in that maybe you're around for years, right? That you're interacting with over years. So there has to be that interaction between you. Notice too that it just says interaction. This does not necessarily need to be like face-to-face interaction, especially in today's age, right? You would still be considered a group, even if maybe you're just emailing or pen pals, or you get together on FaceTime and talk to each other or whatever. That would all still be considered interaction. And the last piece again is you have a shared, and it can be all of these things or any of these things, right? A shared fate, shared goals, or shared identity, right? So we either are, all kind of experiencing the same things, right? That'd be kind of shared fate. We can have similar goals, right? We're all trying to work towards a similar objective at the end. Or it can be a similar identity, right? So we can identify ourselves. A simple example could be like maybe I identify myself as part of a political party, right? That would then be a common identity that we have, right? That I can interact with people based on that identity, and we have a group there. Okay. Now there are some just additional pieces we can talk about when we talk about groups in general. So one thing we know is that groups can be either better or worse than all of its individual members, right? So simple ways I like to think about this is I use kind of like athletic teams. I think are a good example where you can put together teams of athletes where maybe you have a team where every single person on that team is the best, or like the best individual players, right? If you took all the players of a certain sport, let's say like soccer, and these are the top 10, 11, 12 players, whatever. Right? So you've got the top 11 players, you put them all on one team, right? Now, what's important about this is obviously doing that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have the best team, right? So your group can be worse than kind of the combined of all the individuals, right? On the other hand, it can also be better, right? There's teams all the time. You can look at kind of any sport, for example. The team that wins the Super Bowl or wins the World Cup or wins whatever championship it is, isn't necessarily filled with the best players in the world, right? But it's the best team, right? They can function better together than maybe they are as individuals. So that's an important kind of concept to keep in mind, is groups are kind of more than just adding all the individuals together. And then lastly, there is at least something to say that humans may have an innate need to belong to groups. Now, again, we don't necessarily have a for sure 100% reason why this happens, but there does seem to be this kind of need that we have. We have kind of this drive and this need to be a part of groups. One argument for that, if we wanted to think evolutionarily, could be that groups are going to increase your chances to survive and increase your chances to reproduce, right? And again, if we think, again, evolutionarily, if we're thinking that way, if we think 100,000 years ago, early human beings, right? You're hunters and gatherers. If I'm part of a group, part of like a tribe maybe, it makes it a lot more likely that I'm going to survive, makes it a lot more likely that I'm going to reproduce, and then my genes move on, right? After you do that for generations and generations and generations, right? For thousands and thousands of years, eventually, right? All the people that, didn't want to be part of the group kind of die off or don't reproduce. And then we get to today where we have this kind of intrinsic need to do this, right? With something that would have been maybe useful. Now, obviously, it's not necessarily the only explanation that you could come up with, but that is kind of one of the reasons we could kind of talk about, right? This is kind of a little bit off topic a little bit, and we won't really talk too much about it here. But we could also look at, today, right? We could talk about looking at things like depression or things like isolation, and talk about, how we live today is very different than it has been in the past. And this kind of separation for groups maybe is one of the reasons why we see that, right? Maybe we see an increase in depression because we don't have as close knit groups as we used to have in the past, right? And obviously, there's a lot of reasons why that might be, but that could be something that we could look at or talk about as psychologists here. So, what we want to look at now that we kind of have this idea of what groups are is how do groups affect us, right? What do groups actually do to us? Why do we care? So, one of the examples that we could talk about is social facilitation. Social facilitation is the enhanced performance on easy tasks, but impaired performance on difficult tasks due to the presence of others, increasing arousal and response. Now, this should sound really familiar because it's very closely connected to the ideas of the optimal arousal theory, right? Where there is an optimum level of arousal that we want to be kind of successful in doing tasks, or doing anything in general. And again, we talked about how, in that, through that example, we can talk about how things that are simpler, right, when there's more arousal, we do them better. But things that are harder, if we get more arousal, we actually perform worse. The same thing works here. It's just looking specifically at the social side, right? So if I am an athlete performing in a stadium full of thousands and thousands of people, right, that presence of all these other people is arousing, right? That is something that is going to create a physiological arousal in you. Now, how I perform based on that is, that social facilitation part. And again, I'm using the athletics example, but this could function for, pretty much anything you do. But we can see that, right? So if you think about like athletes that are considered like clutch, right? That's this social facilitation, right? That the arousal of those intense moments where there's thousands of people there and you're on the biggest stage in the world, right? That's but they perform better. That is social facilitation, right? On the other hand, we could also talk about people who maybe choke, right? Where they play great all the time, but in those big moments where there's a lot of pressure and you're on that big stage, right? Suddenly you start making mistakes. Same thing, social facilitation, but it's just having a negative impact instead of a positive one. And again, we see this all the time with a million different things. You can just say the same thing for like public speaking, right? I'm sure most everybody has had at least one experience where they were really nervous to speak in front of a crowd or a class or whatever. That's also social facilitation, right? Where if something is a little bit challenging for you, right, having all these people, that presence of all these people there makes you anxious, and then it makes you more likely to perform poorly. The next thing we can talk about is what is called social loafing. So social loafing is it's actually kind of straightforward, and from what it sounds like. So it's basically our tendency to exert less effort when we are working in a group and pooling our efforts towards this common goal, right? As opposed to if we were working individually. So I can kind of give you a simple example, right? When you are, let's say, working on a group project in class, right? And everybody in that group project, right, is kind of working towards one goal, right? Your goal is to complete the project. I generally probably get a good grade. All right, that's your goal. The reality is each of you as individuals probably puts in a lot less effort into reaching that kind of final goal than if you were working individually, right? And the important piece here, and one of the reasons why we see that, is because when you're working individually, you tend to be individually accountable. So an example of this, and it kind of goes back to that first thing we talked about with groups, where we were looking at the idea that they can be better or worse than all the individual members. There's actually been studies done through things like tug of war, right? Where if I have one person by themselves, right, and they're doing like a tug of war against, I don't know, another individual, right, and they can pull like, let's say 100 pounds, right? They can pull 100 pounds of force. If I add another person there who can also individually pull 100 pounds of force, you would expect that, okay, well, now there's two of them, they both pull 100 pounds, so together their force will be 200, right? But what we actually find is it would be less than that. It would be like maybe 180 or something like that. And again, what happens is this social loafing, that we actually just exert less effort when there's a whole bunch of us than when there's not many of us left anymore, right? So we can kind of see that. And again, looking at how our behavior is affected by other people, by these groups that we're in. The next thing we can look at is what is called deindividualization. So this is probably a term that you've heard before. Deindividualization is a loss of a sense of your own individuality and a reduction of these kind of constraints that we would normally have, specifically on deviant behavior, right? So there's a million examples of this. So the idea kind of is when you're in a large crowd of people, or even just a group, right? So you can think about when you're in a group of friends, or in like a big crowd, there's two things that are kind of going on, right? One of the things is that we tend to think less about ourselves individually and more about ourselves as part of our group. We kind of like lose that sense of individuality, right? We kind of become part of the group. And then in addition to that, we kind of lose some of these constraints. So we're a lot more likely to do things that we maybe wouldn't necessarily do if we weren't in this group. So again, we can see this in kind of small group examples. So maybe when you're young, you go out with your friends and maybe you like egg somebody's house or something like that, right? And in that group, in that moment, right, you just do it and you don't really even think anything about it. But would you do that, on your own, right? If it was just you, would you have done that same thing? And the idea is, again, you're kind of doing both these things. Really good examples of this are also when we see like riots and mobs. If you look at kind of like these riots and mobs, and especially when there's violence in them, so like riots obviously tend to get violent. So when we have kind of this violence in them, a lot of times what we see is the people that are committing these different acts don't tend to necessarily just be violent people. A lot of times they're just average, regular people, but they kind of get sucked into this. What sometimes it's like people can like. I think this isn't a psychological term, but like you could say like this mob mentality, right? Again, the idea is instead of thinking, okay, would I do this normally? I'm thinking about the whole group, and I kind of lose that kind of sense of individuality and accountability that comes with it. Again, right, large crowds, they can increase increase anonymity, right? So I don't feel like it's just me as an individual now, I'm part of this group, and decrease self-awareness. So I'm no longer necessarily always aware of kind of what I'm doing. Another way you could think about this too, that as opposed to like maybe necessarily like violence, because those are the kind of examples I used, are things like concerts, right? If you go to a concert or like a club or something like that, right? And there's a whole bunch of people, right? You probably will act in ways that you generally wouldn't if you were by yourself, right? And you'll be more likely to maybe like follow what the rest of the crowd is doing or jump in on different types of things, right? This is kind of that same thing. We lose that kind of sense of individuality, and we kind of these different kind of normative restraints we have, right? These norms that normally govern how we act, right, kind of get decreased a little bit, and we're more likely to act in different ways. The next thing we can talk about is group polarization. So group polarization is basically the idea that when we are in groups, they tend to kind of separate us out. We tend to become polarized by the groups that we're in. And what this means is basically the groups will move away from each other. So there's kind of a few simple examples of this, right? So I'm going to talk about this one right here, this graph that you can see in the slides here. So basically what they did was they took two groups of people. And if I remember, yeah, these was looking at, one group was made of quote unquote low prejudice people. So there's a group of people that all had low levels of prejudice. And then we had a group of people that had higher levels of prejudice, right? And we took those two groups and we separated them and we put them together, right? So we had like a bunch of people that had a high level of prejudice, a bunch of people that had low level of prejudice, and we kind of like put them together and we just said, all right, talk to each other, okay? And so they had group discussions. And what we saw was that throughout those discussions, what would actually happen is both groups would become more extreme. So the people who were low prejudice would become even less prejudiced through that conversation, right? And the same thing happened on the opposite side. The people who were prejudiced became even more prejudiced over time, right? So by interacting with people with, you could say, like-minded people, we become we kind of basically move away from each other. That's the polarization aspect, right? It exaggerates these initial differences, it exaggerates these initial tendencies, and it's kind of separates the groups out further and further and further. And there's some reasons for this, right? So one of them is that this idea that the shared risks makes individual risks seem to be less. So, for example, let's say we're in this high prejudice group. Let's say for some reason I am a part of a group and it's filled with like white supremacists, right? That's people that I'm around. What's going to happen is maybe originally, right, I have these kind of beliefs and maybe these ideas, but maybe they're not super strong. Maybe I'm not like comfortable saying slurs or things like that. But over time, what'll happen is when I'm around people who have those beliefs, right, are maybe more extreme than I am or as extreme as I am, right, or who are willing to do those things, what happens is that I don't feel as at risk about having those feelings, those beliefs, those behaviors as, if I'm not around them. So when all of a sudden it doesn't feel as risky to feel that way, right? I'm more likely to feel that way, right? And I can kind of become more extreme, right? So we can see how it kind of lightens the risk. If I'm in a group of people who I know don't agree with me, right? The risk is really high for me to kind of push those things out there. But if I'm around a bunch of people who do agree with me, right? I'm part of this group. Now it's kind of easier for me to put those ideas out and then become more extreme, more exaggerated. We also see that we also kind of, as well as reducing the amount of risk that we feel, the ideas themselves, especially extreme ones, feel less risky, right? So again, we can use kind of the same example, right? When I'm in a group of people, if I'm in a group and everybody in that group is a white supremacist, right? Really, really extreme ideas don't seem as extreme because everybody I talk to, right, has kind of these similar beliefs. And we can say the exact same thing on the opposite side, right? If I am like very, very pro, like it could be any stance, right? I could be pro, I don't want to say pro anti-war, but I could be like in a group of like anti-war, right? They're incredibly focused on stopping all wars, right? Even really extreme ideas, right, in that case are going to seem less risky, again, because I'm around people that have these kind of similar beliefs, right? And so again, we slowly kind of inch away from each other, right? Opposite sides, and obviously those aren't necessarily opposite sides, but these opposite groups will just slowly kind of push away from each other. And as we group ourselves, right, that kind of continues. Now, this is something that is a natural kind of thing that always happens. So this has always happened even in society hundreds of years ago, where when we're around people that think similarly, it kind of spreads us out. The difference, one of the big differences and a big focus of psychological study today is the big change that's happened as technology has advanced, right? Specifically social media, right? And the reason for that is that social media makes it much, much, much easier for us to move into find these different groups of like-minded individuals, right? If you, for example, are on like Reddit, right, you pick specifically the groups that you are in. So you pick groups that are people like you. If you're on Facebook, if you're on TikTok, if you're on Instagram, if you're on Twitter, right, you find people that are connected to, that are similar to you, right? And so again, we kind of create these groups, and then those groups slowly kind of spread apart. This is an example of this. So this is pulled from a study that was looking at group polarization. Now, it was focusing kind of more on like the social media side of things, and how much of a difference do different kind of things that we can do with social media make. But what this is actually showing here is basically polarization on Twitter. So what we have here are a whole bunch of dots, right? All the dots represent individual Twitter users, okay? So every dot is a person, basically, posting on Twitter. The color of the dot is the political tendency of that person, okay? And so what they did was they actually tracked political hashtags. Like, this is obviously just in politics we're looking at. So they tracked political hashtags. And so what we see is basically where you are left to right here, it basically has to do with the interaction between the groups, right? So who are you interacting? You're going to be closer to the people you interact with more, if that makes sense, right? So if I'm like right next to somebody else, right, or right next to somebody else over here, that means I'm interacting with them a lot. And then all the connections, right, all the little lines are things like retweets, things like likes, things like comments underneath, someone's tweets, things like that, right? All these kind of interactions. Now, what you can probably kind of see here is there's not really many people in the middle, right? There's kind of a gap in between, right? There's some, but there's a pretty big gap in between the two groups, right? What this tells us is there's not a lot of people that are interacting equally with both. We could say like I don't remember if it was Democrat versus Republican or liberal versus conservative, but you can kind of think of it either way, right? There's not really many people that are interacting equally with both, right? Generally, we're interacting almost entirely with people of our own group. Now, there are a few outliers, right? You can see some blues in here that are interacting almost, it seems like a lot more with people on the opposite side, right? There's, I think, maybe one or two little red ones in there here somewhere that are kind of hidden that we can see. But for the most part, they're their own kind of groups. And again, what we can expect is that over time, these groups will continue to separate more and more and more, right? This middle gap would become more and more empty, and the two sides would become, more and more kind of condensed or more collected over into each other. The other big thing that we could talk about here too that has to do with social media is the idea of algorithms, right? So one of the big things is that social media the purpose of it is to get you to stay on, right? Facebook wants you to use Facebook as much as possible. Twitter wants you to use Twitter as much as possible. Instagram wants you to be on Instagram as much as possible. That's what they all do, right? So one way that they do that is they try to show you things that you like, right? So there's a million ways of tracking that, right? But they want to show you things that you like. That way you come back to see more of it. Now, again, right, if I'm, pretty liberal, or if I'm even some liberal, right, I'm going to keep showing you, and I see, oh, you kind of tend to like things that come from this side. You tend to read more into things that come from this side. I'm just going to continue to show you those more and more and more and more, right? I'm going to show you things from over here less and less and less and less, right? And so, again, you can kind of see how this polarization just kind of continues, and it separates and separates and separates. And that's kind of the idea when we're talking about group polarization of what's happening. Again, this happens in face-to-face interactions. It goes beyond politics, but I think politics is the simplest example. But it also, is definitely happening, maybe even at a much probably faster rate when we look at things like social media as well, in these kind of technological groups that we have. The next thing we can talk about is what is called groupthink. So groupthink is something that kind of tends to occur when we have groups. So this is something we've actually kind of talked a little bit about when we talked about normative influence. Groupthink is basically this idea where we have a group of people that need to make some sort of decision. And what happens is when we go to make that decision, people agree with the decision, right? Or they go along with whatever they feel will keep harmony in the group, instead of the kind of more realistic or better alternatives that we have. So a simple example of this is, let's say we have like an idea for a business, right? We have a board meeting, right? And we all get together and we say, okay, does everybody agree with this? And everyone says yes, right? But the reality is about half of us are like, I actually don't think this is a very good idea, right? Um, and again, this is something I'm sure a lot of you have experienced. I'm sure some of you have been in, whether it was a team or a band or um, a club or a group meeting or even something with your friends where everyone's like, okay, yeah, we all want to do this, right? And then everyone's kind of like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But you're kind of like, I don't really think we should do this, or I don't think this is the best way to do it. But you just kind of say yes anyway. That's groupthink, right? Now, again, this has been something that's happened throughout time. There's examples of, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a political example in U.S. history where they went out, I think it was the Bay of Pigs maybe, where they went out and they carried out this kind of plan, and it failed catastrophically, and then kind of all the people were involved were like, yeah, it was really a bad idea, but all those same people had agreed to it ahead of time, right? But it was possibly again one of those things where people just went along with it even though they didn't necessarily think it was probably the best thing to do. One of the big things about groupthink that we can focus on as psychologists is how do we prevent this, right? Because groupthink tends to be really negative or have negative consequences, right? If there should be other alternatives that should be evaluated, we want to make sure we're doing those in almost all situations. So how do we kind of prevent that? So there's kind of a few different ways. You can see them on the bottom there, right? Encouraging discussion, creativity, and different perspectives is kind of the big thing, right? What we want to do is we want to get people to feel comfortable throwing ideas out, feel comfortable coming up with new things, and we're encouraging and kind of rewarding that. I also think this is a good example of another connection we can see with just psychology in general. So in social psych, a lot of the things we talk about here are actually things that are used outside of like the psychological field as far as like research, right? So we can really start connecting a lot of these social psychology ideas into things that are like used in business, for example. So there are psychologists that work, for or with or research things about businesses of like, how do I create a good culture for business? How do I create a good culture for teaching? Actually, is another really big example, right? How do I create a classroom where we don't have groupthink, right? Where we encourage these different ideas, encourage the evaluation of other alternatives, all those kind of different things. So we can see also how we can pull psychology out into maybe more real world examples. The last piece we're going to talk about here is culture. So there's also cultural influences. And again, cultural influences we tend to think about kind of as group influences. It's a little bit different, but it has a lot of the same kind of pieces. So all we really want to do here, this is obviously something you could dive way deeper into, but for our purposes and for our class, it's really just about, okay, what is culture? What does this mean? So I'm just going to read the definition verbatim for you. So the culture is the enduring behaviors, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next, right? Culture, as you can probably tell by that that definition, is very big, very all-encompassing kind of, and kind of vague, right? Behaviors, attitudes, values, traditions. That's a whole bunch of different things shared by a group of people, right? But that's kind of on purpose, right? Because there is a lot of differences when it comes to culture. And we can talk about all sorts of different things. Food can be part of culture. Language can be part of culture. Dance is obviously one. Religion, beliefs, holidays. There's kind of all sorts of different things that we could kind of put in here. The ways that we dress, body ornamentation, all sorts of these different things are aspects of kind of what culture is. And again, obviously, and I think this one's pretty straightforward, culture has an influence on you, right? If you grew up, if you were born and raised as part of, a certain culture, you have differences than people who aren't. If I took you, who you are, and somehow I started your life over and raised you in Japan, or raised you in the Congo, or raised you in Brazil or something like that, right? And put you with a new family, you would come out as a very different person, right? So you can think of how culture also influences, a whole bunch of different things about who we are and how we behave and what we do. So that wraps up this piece here. Again, looking at how groups behave, how groups influence us as individuals, and vice versa. Take a few moments and do a quick summary for me, and I'll see you guys next time.